The fog clung to the trees like a shroud, wrapping the forgotten path in a chill that seeped into the bones. It was 1870, and the prison loomed at the edge of the wilderness, its stone walls rising defiantly against the endless stretch of dark woods that whispered secrets to anyone foolish enough to listen. Iron bars rattled faintly in the wind, but it wasn't the wind that unsettled the guards, it was the low murmurs that drifted in after dusk, voices too soft to understand, too persistent to ignore. Warden Elias Thorne dismissed them as the ravings of madmen, but deep down, he knew better. The inmates, chained in their cells, pressed their ears to the cold floors, straining to catch the words that promised freedom or foretold doom. Dr. Harlan Voss had arrived that spring with crates of vials and instruments, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a man chasing immortality. "Science demands sacrifice," he'd say, his voice smooth as oil, as he selected his first subjects from the ranks of the condemned. The prisoners, desperate men with nothing left to lose, signed away their bodies for a chance at pardon, unaware that the injections coursing through their veins were drawn from essences harvested in the heart of those cursed woods, fungi that glowed faintly in the dark, roots that twisted like veins. At first, the changes were subtle, heightened senses, dreams that bled into waking hours. But then came the nights when the voices grew clearer, calling from the shadows beyond the walls, urging the men to acts of unspeakable violence. Young Samuel Crow, locked away for a crime he swore he didn't commit, was the first to truly listen. His cell was at the far end, closest to the tree-line, where the branches scraped against the stone like skeletal fingers. One midnight, as the moon hung low and bloated, the whispers coalesced into a single, chilling plea: "Join us, release us." Samuel's skin prickled, his blood thrumming with the doctor's serum, and he felt an inexplicable pull toward the forest's depths. Little did he know that the mystery hidden there was no mere hallucination, but an ancient horror awakened by the hubris of men who played God with human flesh. As the experiments escalated, the line between guinea pig and monster began to blur, and the woods waited patiently, hungry for more souls to add to its chorus. She came to the place at the tail end of October, when the maples had bled out and the ground was carpeted with wet, rust-colored leaves that muffled every footstep. The rental car coughed itself silent a quarter-mile back where the logging road surrendered to saplings and brambles, forcing her to walk the rest of the way with nothing but a backpack, a flashlight, and the stubborn conviction that someone needed to remember what happened here. Her name was Mara Ellison, 29, junior crime reporter for a paper most people only read online, and she had spent the last 8 months chasing ghosts in courthouse basements and dusty archives. It started with a single line in an 1872 coroner's report, 3 words buried in a list of routine deaths, "'cause undetermined, voices." From there the trail had twisted through yellowed ledgers, redacted army medical files, and finally a hand-drawn map tucked inside a donated family Bible, the ink so faded it looked like a bruise. Every path led to this forgotten corner of northern Pennsylvania, to a prison that officially never existed. The woods closed around her the moment she stepped off the trail. Pine needles dripped with recent rain, the air tasted metallic, like a storm that refused to break. She followed a depression in the earth that might once have been a supply road, boots sinking into decades of rot. Then the trees parted just enough to reveal the wall, 20 feet of moss-covered granite, half swallowed by vines, stretching away in both directions like the spine of some petrified beast. Iron rings still jutted from the stone where chains had once been fastened. Higher up, narrow slits stared out like empty eye sockets. Mara's pulse quickened. She had seen photographs, grainy scans from a historical society that wanted nothing to do with the story, but standing in front of it was different. The silence here was wrong, too complete, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. She slipped through a breach where mortar had surrendered to roots and entered the prison's throat. Inside, the courtyard was a shallow bowl of mud and fallen leaves. Collapsed cell blocks ringed it like broken teeth. In the center stood the warden's house, its roof caved in years ago, windows blind with boards. That was her destination. If any records had survived fire, flood, and deliberate erasure, they would be there, hidden beneath floorboards or bricked into a chimney, waiting for someone reckless enough to come looking. She tightened the straps of her pack, clicked on her headlamp, and started across the courtyard, every step echoing too loudly in the listening dark. The warden's house breathed rot. Mara crossed the threshold and the temperature dropped as if she had stepped into a cellar. Her headlamp carved a thin tunnel through the black, revealing wallpaper hanging in damp ribbons, a staircase that sagged like a broken spine, and a chandelier reduced to rust and cobwebs. The smell hit next, wet paper, mildew, and something sharper, almost medicinal, that clung to the back of the throat. She moved slowly, testing each floorboard before trusting her weight. Upstairs, the bedrooms had been stripped long ago, but the office at the end of the hall still held its heavy desk, warped and swollen, one leg missing so it tilted drunkenly toward the wall. A brass nameplate lay face down beside it, Elias Thorne, Warden. Mara's beam swept the room and stopped on the fireplace. The hearth was choked with decades of leaves and bird nests, yet the stones around it looked cleaner, as though someone had recently disturbed the grime. She knelt, ignoring the way the cold soaked through her jeans, and began prying at the bricks with the small crowbar she carried for exactly this reason. The third one shifted. Behind it, wrapped in oilskin gone brittle as dead skin, lay 3 leather-bound journals and a tin box no bigger than a cigarette pack. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the top volume. The cover was stamped with the same crest she had seen on the prison gate, a serpent devouring its own tail. Inside, the handwriting was neat, almost delicate, Thorns, judging by the signature on the flyleaf. The first entries were mundane, supply shipments, head counts, disciplinary notes. Then, in April of 1870, the tone changed. A new physician had arrived. Dr. Harlan Voss. He brought specimens of exotic flora, collected under special license from the Western Territories, and requested absolute privacy for his research. Thorne wrote that the doctor paid in gold eagles and asked only for subjects whose loss would occasion no inquiry. Mara turned the pages faster. Names appeared, crossed out in red ink. Dosages. Symptoms: heightened acuity of hearing, vivid nocturnal visions, spontaneous hemorrhaging from the ears. One prisoner claimed to hear his dead mother calling from the woods. Another clawed his own eyes out after 3 nights, screaming that the trees were watching him. Voss's marginalia grew feverish. The compound unlocks doors perception was never meant to open. She was so absorbed she almost missed the soft scrape overhead, like a boot on loose shingles. The beam of her headlamp flicked upward, catching nothing but darkness and drifting dust. Night arrived without warning, the way it does in deep woods. One moment the ruined office was a gray box, the next it was absolute black except for the cone of her headlamp. Mara had planned to be out long before sunset, but the journals refused to let her go. She sat cross-legged on the warped floorboards, pages spread around her like fallen cards, transcribing dates and dosages into her phone until the battery warning glowed red. Then the wind shifted. It came down the chimney first, a cold breath that smelled of turned earth and something coppery. The flame in her small lantern guttered. Outside, the trees began a low, restless murmur, branches rubbing together with the sound of dry bones. She told herself it was only the weather changing, nothing more, and reached to close the top journal. That was when she heard the first voice. It was faint, almost polite, drifting up through the floorboards directly beneath her. A man's voice, mid-sentence, as though continuing a conversation that had never stopped. "Tell them we're still here." The accent was old, Pennsylvania German softened by years behind walls. Mara froze, hand hovering over the leather cover. She waited for it to come again, heart ticking loud in her ears. It did, clearer now, joined by another, higher, almost childlike, cold, so cold, the words rose through the planks like smoke, curling around her ankles. She scrambled to her feet, swinging the headlamp in frantic arcs. The room was empty, door still ajar exactly as she'd left it. Yet the voices kept coming, overlapping, pleading, some angry, some exhausted, all of them threaded with the same raw desperation. They seemed to circle the house, pressing in from every side, until the broken windows vibrated with the pressure of sound that wasn't sound at all. Mara backed toward the hallway, boots crunching on shattered glass. The voices followed, closer now, intimate, as if the speakers stood just behind her shoulder. One repeated a single name, Samuel, Samuel, over and over, the syllables cracking like knuckles. Another laughed, a wet, broken sound that made the hairs on her neck lift. She reached the top of the staircase and the lantern finally died, plunging everything into blackness so complete it felt solid. In that sudden dark the voices swelled into a chorus, dozens, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once, a tide of lost men trying to claw their way back into the world through the only throat still willing to listen. Samuel Crow had arrived at the prison in the spring of 1870 with a split lip and a sentence of 20 years for a murder he still swore was not his doing. He was 23, slight of build, with pale eyes that seemed to look past people rather than at them, as if he were always listening for something just out of hearing. When Dr. Voss posted the notice, volunteers needed for medical study, compensation in the form of time shaved from sentence, Samuel was the first to step forward. He told the guard he had nothing left outside those walls anyway. His mother was dead, his sweetheart had married his cousin, and the only thing waiting for him in the world was more bad luck. Better to gamble on the doctor's needle than rot counting cracks in the ceiling. They took him to the infirmary after lights out, a low stone room lit by a single kerosene lamp that painted everything the color of old blood. Voss himself administered the first injection, sliding the needle into the soft crook of Samuel's arm with the tenderness of a lover. The serum was cold going in, then hot, then cold again, like river water and molten iron chasing each other through his veins. Voss watched him the way a jeweler watches a stone under the loupe, noting every twitch, every bead of sweat. That night Samuel dreamed he walked barefoot through the woods beyond the wall. The trees had faces, not carved but grown, mouths open in silent screams, eyes milky and blind. A voice, his mother's, though she had been dead 5 years, spoke from the moss, "Listen closer, boy. They're almost ready for you." He woke with the taste of soil in his mouth and the certainty that something had followed him back into the cell. By the third dose the dreams no longer waited for sleep. Colors sharpened until the gray walls bled violet and rust. He could hear the heartbeats of the men in neighboring cells, steady as clocks, and beneath them another rhythm, slow and vast, like something enormous turning over in the earth. At night the whispers started, soft as moth wings against the bars. They knew his name. They told him secrets, which guard was stealing food, which prisoner planned to hang himself with his own belt come winter. They promised that if he let them in all the way, they would open the gates and walk him out under the moon like a free man. Samuel pressed his palms to his ears until they bled, but the voices only laughed and slipped between his fingers, warm and wet as breath. The rain started just after midnight, a cold, steady hiss that turned the ruined courtyard into a shallow lake. Mara had retreated to the ground floor of the warden's house, barricading the door with the broken desk and huddling inside her sleeping bag with the lantern burning low. Sleep refused to come. Every time she closed her eyes she saw the red ink names in Thorne's ledger. Every time she opened them she heard the voices threading through the walls like ivy. Footsteps approached from outside, slow, deliberate, the unmistakable crunch of gravel under boots. She killed the lantern and pressed herself against the wall, heart battering her ribs. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the boarded window. A silhouette appeared between the slats, tall, hunched, wrapped in a slicker the color of wet bark. A man's voice, cracked and old, spoke through the boards as though the wood weren't even there. "You're reading what you shouldn't, girl." Mara's mouth went dry. She fumbled for the crowbar, raised it like a club. "I ain't here to hurt you," the stranger continued. "But you keep poking at those pages and something worse will. Been watching you since you crossed the creek. Thought maybe you'd turn back when the sun dropped. Most do." She found her voice. "Who are you?" "Name's Caleb Weaver. My granddaddy poured the mortar for this place. Stayed on after, cutting timber, keeping the roads from healing over. Family curse, you could call it." He tapped the window frame with something metallic. "Those voices you're hearing? They ain't ghosts, not the way folks think. They're echoes caught in the sap. Dr. Voss brewed his medicine from the black mushrooms that grow where the old hanging tree used to stand. Tree was struck by lightning in '29, split clean open, and what spilled out wasn't sap at all. Looked like blood, smelled like pennies and church incense. Voss paid men to harvest it by moonlight. Said it would make soldiers who never slept, never feared. Instead it made men who never stopped listening." Rain drummed harder on the roof. Somewhere deeper in the prison a metal groaned, as though the building itself were shifting in its sleep. "They tried to burn the woods afterward," Caleb said. "Fire wouldn't take. Just smoked and smoked until the sky turned the color of a bruise. Whatever's rooted there is still thirsty. And now you've gone and read its name out loud enough for it to notice." His shadow withdrew. Boots crunched away into the dark, leaving only the rain and the voices rising again, closer, intimate, tasting her name for the first time. The voices did not fade with daylight, they only changed pitch, becoming a low, constant drone beneath the birdsong, like a hive buried under the forest floor. Mara left the warden's house at first light, soaked to the bone, the journal sealed in plastic inside her pack. Caleb Weaver was gone, but he had left a sign, a strip of orange surveyor's tape tied to a sapling, pointing deeper into the trees where no trail had any right to exist. She followed it because the alternative was worse. The voices had learned her name overnight and now repeated it in overlapping waves. "Mara, Mara, come see, Mara, we waited so long," until the syllables felt branded on the inside of her skull. The tape led her north, past the collapsed laundry block and the old punishment cells half swallowed by roots, until the prison wall reappeared on her left, cracked and leaning, and the forest pressed in from the right so tightly that branches scraped her shoulders like pleading fingers. After 20 minutes the tape ended at a clearing no wider than a boxcar. The ground here was bare except for a perfect circle of white stones, each the size of a man's fist, arranged with mathematical care. At the center rose a stump, black and glassy, the remains of an oak so ancient its rings had fused into something that looked more like obsidian than wood. Carved into its surface were symbols Mara recognized from the margins of Voss's notes, spirals that hurt to follow, angles that refused to add up to 180 degrees no matter how many times she blinked. She stepped over the stones and the voices cut off mid-word, leaving a silence so sudden her ears rang. Kneeling, she brushed leaf mold from the stump and found the carvings weren't just cut, they were grown, the lines raised and pulsing faintly, as though sap still moved beneath the bark. When her bare fingers touched the central spiral a jolt shot up her arm, sharp and sweet, the same cold hot burn Samuel Crow had described a century and a half earlier. Images flared behind her eyes, prisoners on their knees in this same circle, mouths open, black fluid trickling from their ears while Voss stood over them with a silver ladle, moonlight thick as syrup pouring through the branches, roots uncoiling from the soil to cradle each man's head like a mother. And beneath it all, something vast turning its attention toward the disturbance, lids peeling back on eyes that had never known sunlight. Mara jerked her hand away. The voices rushed back in, louder, almost joyful, as if they had been holding their breath for her arrival. The moment her skin left the stump the clearing erupted in sound, not the whispers anymore but a single, grinding note, low enough to rattle her teeth and make the white stones jump like hail on tin. Mara staggered backward, tripped over the circle's edge, and landed hard on her tailbone. The forest tilted. For an instant the trees were no longer trees but pillars of gray flesh veined with black, breathing in slow, tidal rhythm. Then the vision snapped into focus and she understood what Voss had truly been chasing. It was never about medicine or super soldiers or even immortality. The black sap, the mushrooms, the midnight harvest, all of it had been bait. The thing in the soil had been here long before the prison, long before the Lenape walked these ridges. It slept coiled beneath the roots, dreaming in frequencies that human ears could only catch as grief or longing. Voss, arrogant and half-mad with ambition, believed he could siphon its power the way one taps a maple. Instead he cracked the shell. The first injection was a knock on a door that had no handle on the inside. The prisoners were not test subjects. They were tuning forks. Each dose aligned their nervous systems to the entity's wavelength, turning living men into antennae. The voices they heard were not hallucinations, they were translations of a hunger too vast for language. When the men began bleeding from the ears, clawing at the walls, carving spirals into their own flesh, it was only the overflow, the static of something trying to squeeze through a pinhole. By the time the warden realized the truth, 37 inmates had been treated. 29 died screaming. 8 vanished from locked cells, leaving behind only their clothes folded neatly on the cots and black handprints burned into the stone. Thorne ordered the infirmary torched, but the fire crawled backward up the chimney and died. He sent for a priest, then a Pinkerton exorcist, then a company of soldiers with Gatling guns. None returned. In the final entry of the third journal, written in a hand that shook so badly the ink spidered across the page, Thorne confessed he could hear his dead wife calling from the woods and that he was going to answer. The prison was abandoned overnight. The state erased it from every map. The clearing tilted again, harder this time, and Mara felt the ground soften under her knees as though the soil had turned to thick syrup. Her vision split, one eye saw the blackened stump and the white stones, the other saw the same place in 1870, moonlight silvering the circle while 37 men knelt in shackles, mouths slack, black threads of sap dripping from their ears into the roots below. Samuel Crow was closest to the stump. His pale eyes were wide open but unseeing, rolled back until only crescents of white showed. From his parted lips poured not breath but a low, continuous note that made the air shimmer. The other prisoners echoed him, a chord of living sound that rose and fell like a heartbeat. Above them the branches of the great oak, still alive then, bowed inward, leaves folding together until the tree became a single closed fist. Something inside it flexed. Mara understood then that the voices were not asking for release. They were warning. Every man who had taken the serum became a key turning in a lock that should have stayed rusted shut. The more keys turned, the wider the gap. When the last prisoner died or disappeared, the process simply paused, the door left ajar, the thing behind it waiting for the next set of hands stupid enough to finish the job. The woods had kept the chorus alive all these years, replaying the final chord through rot and rain, a lighthouse beacon for any mind newly tuned to hear it. Her own blood sang with the same frequency now. She could feel the spiral branded under the skin of her fingertips, pulsing in time with the slow, patient heartbeat beneath the earth. Images poured through her unbidden, Caleb Weaver's grandfather pouring mortar over a circle already stained black, state officials signing erasure orders while something watched from the tree lean, every missing hiker, every hunter found with his ears bleeding, every local child warned never to follow voices in the woods. All of them had brushed the edge of the cord and been pulled in to keep it ringing. The prisoners' faces turned toward her across the century, mouths moving in perfect unison. Not pleading now. Apologizing. They had tried to close the door from the inside and failed. The only way left was to break the last key before it could turn all the way. Mara looked down. Her right hand was already reaching for the stump again, fingers spreading against the carved spiral as if drawn by magnet. The voices rose into a single, gentle invitation that felt exactly like coming home. The clearing had shrunk to the size of a grave. The white stones now stood upright like teeth, and the blackened stump had grown taller, its surface rippling as though something inside were testing the shell. Mara's hand hovered an inch above the central spiral, trembling with the effort of holding back. Every heartbeat pushed it closer, every breath tasted of sap and pennies. The chorus had distilled itself into one voice, Samuel Crow's, soft, almost tender, speaking directly into the bone behind her ear. "You're the last note, Mara. Finish the chord and we all go quiet. Or break the key and damn another 150 years of screaming." She understood the choice with terrible clarity. If she pressed her palm to the carving, the door would swing wide. The entity would flood out, wearing every prisoner's stolen voice like a cloak, and the woods would finally have the silence they promised. No more whispers. No more disappearances. Just an ending vast enough to swallow counties. If she refused, the song would continue, thinner, hungrier, reaching farther each season until it found someone else whose curiosity outweighed their fear. Her fingers curled into a fist. Blood from where she had bitten her lip spattered the stump. The moment the red touched the spiral, the clearing convulsed. The upright stones slammed flat, the ground buckled, and the stump split lengthwise with a sound like a glacier calving. Black sap boiled up, thick as tar, carrying with it the smell of every grave ever dug. From the fissure rose a single root, pale and jointed, ending in a hand that was almost human except for the extra knuckle on each finger. It reached for her face with the patience of something that had waited since the last ice age. Mara did not flinch. She unzipped her pack, pulled out the tin box she had taken from the warden's fireplace, and flipped the lid. Inside lay a single glass ampoule filled with the original 1870 serum, Vasa's last dose, saved by Thorn as evidence or penance. She smashed it against the root. The glass shattered, the remaining serum hissed where it touched the pale flesh, eating inward like acid. The hand spasmed, curling back into the fissure, dragging ribbons of black sap with it. A sound rose, not human, not animal, but the noise a mountain might make if it could feel pain. The stump collapsed inward, the clearing folded, and the voices cut off mid-syllable, leaving only the ordinary rustle of wind in ordinary leaves. Mara stood alone in sudden, brutal quiet, her shadow long and trembling on ground that was only dirt again. Somewhere far below, something settled back into restless sleep, the door not closed but scarred, the lock melted, the key, her hand, already blistering where the serum had splashed.